is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering High Wizardry, Young Wizards Series, Book 3. Chapters titled Randomization and Variables. They are not numbered, so I don't know what number chapters they are. In these chapters, Dairine winds up on a planet full of aliens with no real idea what to do, why she chose to be here. Really, no idea what she was thinking. And Dairine, she may be smart, but she's still 9 years old. That takes you so far. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. So thank you, first of all, of course, to Devin for commissioning this episode. Devin commissioned this one and the last one. He might have commissioned the one before as well, I'm pretty sure. So far, he is solely responsible for this book. This episode is so, this couple of chapters is so wild and full of really imaginative ideas that I don't know where to start. I was talking about it yesterday with Owen, trying to explain to him that what I have really enjoyed doing with Spoil Me is finding out how many different ways magic can work. And that's still, of course, at play here because of the computer aspect and everything, which is just so cool. But I think really what it comes down to when I talk about that being impressive to me is the sheer imagination that a lot of authors have. And I wonder at times whether I'm at all capable of doing things the way they have. If I were going to sit down and imagine a different world, and imagine all of the variety of creatures and really try and just spitball some of the weirdest stuff that I could think of. I don't know that a sentient bowl of Jell-O, which exists in this section, would ever be something that would even cross my mind. And that's the sort of thing that bums me out as a person, that I don't even know if I have the sheer capability to come up with things so far outside the box. And I am really impressed with the fact that, between this and some of the undead creatures in the Sabriel and Lyriel books, I have just really had my ass handed to me in terms of expectations. And I am enjoying Spoil Me because of how full of the unexpected it's been. So I'm going to start this off with randomization. Those of you who may not remember, we ended the last section with Dairine basically booking it to the moon because she was in the space. I can't remember the name of the museum, but it was a NASA museum, if I'm not mistaken. And her sister was agreed to let her go to the bathroom, thinking that's all she was going to be doing. Dairine goes into the stall and uses her magic computer to get herself the fuck out of there and leaves a sort of doorway to the moon that she had not meant to leave. I don't think that she fully appreciated that was still there when she left. And it was down to Nita to close that up and make it safe for everybody again. And also to try and track her sister down because, like I said in the intro, while Dairine may be intelligent, she's also still 9 years old and does not really take into consideration all of the things that I do as an adult, which apparently don't even occur to her until she is where she was trying to go. And this is the sort of thing that, I want to say, well, you're just 9, so you wouldn't know. But also, I think that there is an additional, like, factor here, which you could call arrogance, or you could call even just sheer anxiety. And this is something that came up in a recent episode of Lyrial. I have, after just talking about how I don't think I have the imagination that a lot of authors do to come up with a bunch of like really cool ways that magic works, or a bunch of different creatures, I will say that I have an amazing imagination when it comes to trying to invent scenarios in which things have gone wrong. And so for that, I feel like that's not just something that I've developed as an adult. I feel like I've always had that I've always been, I don't want to say a timid child, but I've been cautious because I have always like been a fan of fairy tales, and there is nothing so reliable in fairy tales as people who walk into a situation without considering, you know, if I ask for a wish, what many ways can this wish go wrong? Things like that. So I think that I, even at 9 years old, would still have considered a lot of the things that Dairine does not consider here, because I had that kind of anxiety just in my personality. Whether or not that was something that was like bred into me, I don't know. But she seems to be, arrogant isn't even just the word. I feel like there's a sort of almost like, she is so, I guess that this still falls under the title of arrogance. She's so sure that she's going to know what she's getting into when she gets there. And it's mentioned later exactly what her expectations were and how completely absurd they seem to her when she stops and thinks about them. And I really appreciated that was mentioned and specifically talked about, because I was sort of wondering what she thought was going to happen. But so, all right, let's start off. The first sentence is, Dairine did not go straight out of the galaxy from Mars. Oh, that's right. It was a doorway to Mars, not the moon. Sorry. Like many other wizards when they first cut planet loose, she felt that she had to do a little local sightseeing first. She was some while about it. Part of this was caused by discomfort. The jump from Earth to Mars, a mere 49 million miles, had been unsettling enough, with its feeling of being first pinned to a wildly rolling ball, and then violently torn loose from it. But it hadn't been too bad. Piece of cake, Dairine had thought, checking the transit directory on the computer. Somewhere out of the solar system next. What's this star system? Arleporus? It's pretty close. But she changed her mind and headed for the moons of Jupiter instead, and this turned out to be a good thing. From Mars to Jupiter, bypassing the asteroid belt, was a jump of 342 million miles, and the huge differences between the two planets' masses, vectors, and velocities caused Dairine to become the first Terran to lose her lunch on Jupiter's outermost satellite, Ananke. So, first of all, I would like to just come straight out and admit to you all that when it says the difference in their vectors, I don't know what that means. Mass and velocity, that I get. You know, they're each spinning at a different speed through space. They're a different size. They have a different density, whatever. But as far as like their vector, I looked up what it meant, and the definition was still just as much of a mystery to me as the original word. So that did not help at all. That's when you really know you're out of your depth, by checking a definition and it makes no more sense to you after reading it. So she does like a couple of different planets just out of pure curiosity, pretty much, and wants to, you know, get used to traveling this way over fits and starts, because she had such an intense experience getting to Jupiter. And there's some descriptions of really cool, like, scenes in front of her. I'm going to read this one. The view did more than anything else to revive her. The great banded mass of Jupiter swiftly traversing the cold night overhead, shedding yellow-red light all around on the methane snow. Dairine sat down in the dry, squeaky snow and breathed deeply, trying to control her leftover heaves. Where she sat, mist curled up and snowed immediately down again as the methane sublimated and almost instantly recrystallized to solid phase in the bitter cold. Dairine decided that getting used to this sort of travel gradually was a good idea. So yeah, I just think that is such a cool, like, I would love to know what kind of research was put into the descriptions of the behavior of elements on each of these planets. Because, you know, we get this one here with the weird methane snow. Then we get let's see, I'm trying to find, because there's a long description about the, I'll read this. Dairine looked and looked at the transit programs, which could, as she had just proved, leave you standing on the surface of a satellite 400 million miles away from where you started, not half embedded in it, not splatted into it like a bloody smear because of some forgotten vector that left you still moving a mile a second out of phase with the surface satellite, or at the right speed but in the wrong direction. Finally, she decided not to tamper, because she's looking at all this and she's like, well, maybe I can improve on this. And she starts to be like, you know what? This has so many factors and moving parts that I think I'm just going to leave it be, which is the one bit of wisdom that she really shows this time around. So she figures out how to get food, which is just crazy to me, but she's able to just open a little hole in other space and go into her kitchen at home and get bologna and then create a storage pocket and keep them there. Which just, honestly, guys, is that the craziest shit? I can't. That is banana pants. But anyway, so she stopped on Io, another one of Jupiter's moons, and spent a while watching the volcanoes spit white-hot molten sulfur 10 miles out from the surface, sulfur that eventually came drifting back down as a leisurely, dusty, golden snow in the delicate gravity. Then she braced herself as best she could and jumped for Saturn's orbit, 401 million miles farther out, and handled it a little bit better, suffering nothing worse than a cold sweat and a few dry heaves. Here, there were 20 moons, too many for Dairine at the moment. But she did stop at Titan, the biggest satellite in the solar system, and spent a while perched precariously on a peak slicked with hydrogen snow, looking down thoughtfully at the methane oceans that washed the mountain's feet. Several times she thought she saw something move down there, something that was not one of the peculiar long, high methane waves that the light gravity made possible. But the light was bad under the thick blue clouds, and it was hard to tell. She went on. So there's all of these really, really cool descriptions of different planets and what it looks like when you're actually sitting on the surface of them. And I just am super curious to know how this author came up with all of this. Like, I'm assuming that there was a ton of research involved. There could have not been. There could just be like a little bit of research and then the author just decided to invent whatever. But it feels too specific to do that. So if anybody has any information on that, I'd be really interested in hearing it just out of my own edification, because whenever you choose to write about this sort of thing, it sounds like a really good idea. And I speak from experience until you start to really look into it any more than the surface. And then you start to realize, if you are not experienced in the subject matter already, just how out of your depth you are and how much you need to like educate yourself in the sheer basics before you can get started on the section of the story that you intended to be researching for this time around. And I wonder if this author already had some background in astronomy and, you know, like or maybe just had a personal interest and had read a bunch and knew some of this to begin with, or whether they had to start from scratch and how sort of overwhelming that would be. And who do you consult? Like, you'd have to find somebody who at least had some knowledge of physics, if not specifically like space travel, to ask them what potential, if you were going to discount anything like worrying about temperature changes or chemicals or oxygen, if we're just purely talking about the travel, I'm sure that still takes a ton of help to figure out all of how that would work and what the pitfalls would be. So anyway, she finally decides that she has seen enough of the local solar system and that she is going to go outside of it. Extra systemic jump, she said hurriedly. Coordinates? Read out flagged planets. And reads a bunch of them. The closest, said Dairine, feeling a touch nervous about this. Atmosphere status? Earth-like within acceptable parameters. Let's go, Dairine said. Syntax error 24, said the computer. Rephrase of precision. Run. And when she says run, for a second I had forgotten that that's like the command, and I was like, run, why? What happened? But it's just how she's getting her computer to, function. So this is really unsettling, guys. There's something about traveling outside of our local solar system that changes the way all of this seems to operate. Like, her whole self gets almost fucking destroyed by this. I won't even say destroyed, because it just seems to be super painful. It's not without consequence, in other words. But this seems to be part of the routine as well. So saying she was almost destroyed makes it sound like something went wrong. And it didn't. This is just how it works. But I'm going to read this to you because there's a moment that really fucking made my skin crawl a little. So she says run. And then it says, a galaxy's worth of white fire pinned her to the rolling planet. Then the forces she had unleashed tore Dairine loose and flung her out into the darkness that did not break. For what seemed like ages, the old echoes of the Big Bang breaking over her like waves were all Dairine had to tell her she was still alive. The darkness grew intolerable. Eventually, she became aware that she was trying to scream, but no sound came out. Nothing but that roar and the terrible laughter behind it. Laughter. And light pierced her and the universe roared at her and she hit the planet with a feeling like dreaming of falling out of bed. So, something is out there laughing at her, and Dairine is not even frightened by this so much as annoyed about it. She ached in every bone and she was angry. She hated being laughed at under the best of circumstances, even when it was family doing it. Whatever had been laughing at her was definitely not family, and she wanted to get her hands on it and teach it a lesson. So I feel like there's a couple of things we need to address here. First of all, whenever somebody has that reaction to being laughed at, I feel like that's a really big fucking red flag about their character. And I've said this already, that I relate to Dairine in a lot of ways, and it sort of freaks me out. But there are moments like that where I really am like confirmed how different we are. I am somebody, I feel like the main reason that I have the reaction that I do to hearing that people don't like to be laughed at is because I associate taking yourself too seriously with a lack of self-awareness, usually paired with some sort of assumption that you are like better than most people, and that if they are laughing at you, they fail to understand what you understand about yourself, which is that a lot of times you are their superior. That's how I think people feel who don't like to be laughed. And like, look, being laughed at when you are trying to do something dead serious and people are just not taking you seriously, that's a whole other thing. This, like, being laughed at is not the same. This is a laugh of something that's obviously like malicious, but she's reacting as if it's laughing at her on the playground. She's reacting in a very immature, childish way. And that tells me, paired with her, like, with it being specifically said, even when it's in good faith laughter, when it's her family doing it, people who love her, she still hates it. I feel like that is very, very important. We're not talking about somebody who's been bullied and so has a sort of like reaction to laughter related to a trauma. This is somebody who doesn't believe that you can be laughed at and still be taken seriously. And the thing is, guys, those of you who listen to this show probably know, I am somebody who looks for the absurd in everything, because that's part of how I get by. We all have different ways of coping with the world and what it is. We all have different ways of dealing with our own shortcomings and addressing or not addressing them and trying to be better or not trying to be better. My way of trying to be better is to recognize the inherent absurdity of some of the ways that I operate as a person, and trying to face the fact that some of the choices I make, or the assumptions that I make, or the patterns that I have are really foolish, because that's sometimes the only way to like fix something, is to kind of get to the root of it and be like, oh my God, that is silly. I can't believe I've been doing that. That doesn't even make any sense. And if you can't do that, if you can't see the silliness about yourself at times, that means that you don't have the awareness that is required to do better. Does that make sense? You don't understand how anybody could see something humorous about you because you don't have any perspective. You're not able to step outside of yourself and look back and see what other people can see. And that's not an easy thing to do. I'm not trying to trivialize it like it's just, most people can just have this perspective. But I think there is a certain personality type that is better at it than others, and that personality type is often somebody who has a lot of empathy. And the fact that Dairine is reacting this way to laughter, to me, tells me she doesn't have a lot of empathy. She doesn't have a lot of self-awareness or perspective. It's, for me, even as much as so many other things have been described about her personality and have been alarming, for me, this is the one that really, more than anything, cements that she is maybe at her core a person that is constantly going to have to be battling a darkness inside of herself, because she has a tendency to not see clearly, and so she might be in more need of outside help and perspective, and in more need of instruction on how to make use of that than somebody like Nita would be, So anyway, that's just for me, laughter is incredibly important. It's part of why I do what I do. Laughter is a way of not just whistling in the dark, but actually investigating the way that you feel about things and still feel safe while you do it, and still feel like you are not in a heavy judgment zone, or that if you are in a judgment zone, you're in good company and there are plenty of other people who are experiencing something with you. Laughter is key to practically everything about how I have decided to live my life. And if she can't see how valuable it can be, that's a problem. So anyway, sidetracked there for a minute, but she lands on this very, very sort of slick surface. And we wind up finding out later, I think, that this is this isn't the planet. There's a planet later on that has a silicone, lava rain. And it winds up laying this perfectly flat, incredibly smooth surface to everything. Ranked all around her in racks 40 or 50 feet high were huge objects made of blue metal, each seeming made of smaller blocks stuck randomly together. The block things and the odd racks that held them were all lit garishly by a high, glowing green-white ceiling. What is this, some kind of warehouse? Dairine thought. So she almost gets knocked down by this thing, and it turns out, we find out later, that she is at an airport, and that the things that she at first mistakes for alien life forms are actually luggage. So she's kind of in the middle of the luggage handling area. So imagine winding suddenly on a tarmac outside an airport between a couple of people who are tossing suitcases between one another to load up a plane. That's essentially what's happening here. But yeah, she goes on thinking that these things are people for too long, and eventually gets set straight by a creature that asks her, "Excuse me, why are you talking to our luggage?" which is the most amusing thing. But first, let's talk about her realization that she didn't think this through. Dairine got up. She was still having trouble breathing. What have I been thinking of? She began to realize that all her ideas about meeting her first alien creatures had involved her being known, even expected. "Dairine's here, finally," they were supposed to say. "Now we can get something done." And then she and they would set out to save the universe together. Because of her own blindness, she'd gotten so excited that she jumped into a totally alien environment without orientation or preparation, and as a result, she'd been nearly run over in a parking lot. My own fault, she thought, disgusted with herself. It won't happen again. So, the thing is, it will happen again. She just thinks it won't because, bless her, she thinks that she can control that sort of thing. But yeah, the idea that she expected somebody to, like, be waiting for her is really, really interesting. And again, betrays a sort of entitlement that I find kind of fascinating about her character. Like, it is just so different than how I would have acted at her age. I was afraid of being a nuisance. From a young child, I was afraid of taking up too much space, of being too loud, of being obnoxious. And so everything that I did was in an effort to make myself less intrusive and, like, just kind of be smaller. And I would never ever assume that somebody knew that I was coming, or assume that people were, like, waiting for me when I hadn't. Like, it would just never even enter my mind to have this sort of attitude. And the fact that she does is just another really revealing thing about her. So finally, somebody asks why she's talking to the luggage. And she realizes, like, oh shit, I have got this so very wrong. And this creature is just really amusing to me. It'd be pretty poor luggage that didn't walk, at least. Good luggage levitates, and the new models pack and unpack themselves. You must have come here from a fair way out. My gait is about to become patent, the alien said. I don't know what that means. Come along, I'll show you the way to the departures hall. Or are you meeting someone? They started to walk. Dairine began to relax just a little. This was more like it. No, she said, I'm just traveling. But please, what planet is this? Earth, said the alien. Dairine was surprised for a second, and then remembered having read somewhere that almost every sentient species calls its own planet Earth, or the world, or something similar. I mean, what do other people call it? All kinds of things, as usual. Silly names, some of them. There'll be a master list in the terminal. You can check that. So, this is crazy interesting to me, the idea that many other sentient species just call their planets Earth. I mean, I guess that sort of makes sense in a way, but that suggests that everybody's operating under the same sort of language, which I don't really get how that works. But, you know, like, I don't really know how I feel about that. There's something about it I like, and there's something about it that doesn't really work for me. So there's all kinds of things that she isn't ready for here. First of all, there's like a conveyor belt, which we have a version of in our own airports to try and get from one place to another without walking. And it's one of those things that I know a lot of people make fun of, but it really, if you are somebody who travels a lot, you know that there are a lot of moments where you're like low-key in a rush, not in a rush that you have to be running, but in a rush that you really can't stop to do something. But you also can't do that thing with all of your bags while you're walking. So I love those little conveyor belts because they give you a chance to like go through your bag and find something or like send a text or whatever, but still keep pace and still manage to get where you're going, like with time to spare. So anyway, she said they reach this spot and the alien says, the crossings, what do you think? She could not have told him in an hour's talking. Crossing Hypergate facility on Rearhath B is renowned among the billion homeworlds for its elegant classical Liline architecture and noble proportions. But Dairine's only cogent thought for several minutes was that she had never imagined being in an airline terminal the size of New Jersey. The ceiling, or ceilings, for there were thousands of them, layered, interpenetrating, solid and lacy, in steel and glass, in 100 materials and 100 colors, all towered up into a distance where clouds, real clouds, gathered. About a quarter of a mile off to one side, it appeared to be raining. Through the high greenish air, under the softened light of the fluorescing sky that filtered in through 1,000 roofs, small objects that might have been machines droned along, towing parcels and containers behind them. Beneath, scattered all about on the terminal floor, were stalls, platforms, counters, racks, built in shapes Dairine couldn't understand, and with long, tall signs placed beside them that Dairine couldn't begin to read. And among the stalls and kiosks, the whole vast white floor was full of people, clawed, furred, shelled, armored, upright or crawling, avian, insectile, mammalian, lizard-like, vegetable, mingling with forms that could not be described in any earthly terms. There were a very few hominids, none strictly human, and their voices were lost in the rustling, wailing, warbling, space-softened cacophony of the terminal floor. People hopped and stepped and leaped and walked and crawled and oozed and slid and tentacled and went in every imaginable way about their uncounted businesses, followed by friends and families and fellow travelers, by luggage floating or walking, all purposeful, certain, every one of them having somewhere to go and going there. Everyone except Dairine, who was beginning to wish she had not come. Dairine, listen. You should feel that way. You were dumb. You are a dum-dum. Why would you do this to yourself? So, finally, the alien says, here you are, arrivals over there, departures over that way, stasis and preservation down there. And then there's like a series of exclamation points over there. The computer made a staticky noise that suggested it was unable to translate something. And of course, waste disposal. You enjoy your trip now. I have to catch up with my fathers. Have a nice death. Okay, can we just talk about the fact that it said have a nice death? And Dairine doesn't seem at all concerned about that? Let's take a look again at what this creature said. Arrivals over there, departures over that way, stasis and preservation down there, blank over there, and of course, waste disposal. I don't feel like this is the kind of thing that Dairine expects it to be. We don't really find out enough about it, but I'm going to go on record as saying if she had just decided to try and get a ticket to something, could have gotten herself in some real bad trouble. But I don't really have a lot to go on with that. Just being told, have a nice death. I don't like it. Not even a little bit. Dairine stood quite still for a few minutes. She had no desire to hit on one of those squares by accident. I'm a spud, she thought. A complete imbecile. Look at this. Stuck in an airport. Something like an airport with no money. No ID that these people will recognize. No way to explain how I got here or how I'm going to get out. No way to understand half of what's going on. Scared to death to move. And pretty soon some security guard or cop or something is going to see me standing here and come over to find out what's wrong. And they're going to haul me off somewhere and lock me up. The thought was enough to hurriedly start her walking again. Yeah, girl, you best get out of there because TSA is not going to be playing with you. She is just... Again, astonishing to me in how she can be really intelligent about some things and then just not think anything else through. I just don't know how you exist like that. And she starts to realize she's looking for a place to sit down because she wants to take a look at her computer again and get some advice. She tries to walk through a certain area and finds that there's a sort of invisible barrier that prevents her from coming through because she doesn't have a ticket on her, which is like got some sort of computer chip. Now, everybody, I would like to remind you all that this was written in 1990, or it was published in 1990. It was written before that. So the fact that there are some things in this that are genuinely how things work now is just really like fascinating to me. And there's a particular thing that I love, which we will get to a little bit later. So she finally manages to sit down, and it's there's a moment of trying to, because like there's an area that appears to be a spot to rest and sit down, but there doesn't seem to be any like actual chairs. And I love this weird description. The creature she passed ignored her. Dairine found it difficult to return the compliment. One of the racks had what looked like a giant blue vampire bat hanging in it. Or no, it had no fur. The thing was actually more like a pterodactyl, and astonishingly pretty. The blue was iridescent like a hummingbird's feathers. Dairine walked around it, fascinated, for quite a long time, pretending to look for a chair. But there seemed to be no chairs in this particular area. The closest to a chair-like thing was a large, low bowl that was full of what seemed to be purple jello, except that the jello put up a long, blunt limb of itself, the end of which swiveled to follow as Dairine passed. She hurried by. The effect was rather like being looked at by a submarine periscope, and the jello thing had about as much expression. So finally, she opens the computer, and the computer asks her, what do you want to know, essentially? And she doesn't even know where to begin asking questions, which is understandable. She says, I want to go somewhere else. Acknowledged. Executing. No, don't, Dairine said. Overridden, said the computer. Help facility, Dairine said, breathing hard. Her heart was pounding. Online. Why did you start doing that? OK is a system command causing an exit from the help facility and return to command level, said the computer. Do not run any program until I state the full command with the arguments and end the sequence with run. Affirmative, said the computer. Syntax change confirmed. Oh, Lord, Dairine thought. I've started messing with the syntax and I don't even understand it. I will never use a program again till I've read the docs. So again, she's learning that she should be a little bit more humble with it. But one could argue she's learning too late. The following is a string of parameters for a world I want to transit to. I will state end of list when finished. Affirmative. Awaiting listing. I want to go somewhere else. I want to go somewhere where there are going to be people like me. I want to go somewhere where I'm expected. Somewhere where I can use some of this magic. Somewhere where I can sit down and figure out what it means. Somewhere where I will have time to sit down and figure out what it means. A couple of days, 48 hours. Next argument. Somewhere. One more time she stopped, considering the wild number of variables she was going to have to specify. And the truth was, she didn't know what she was after. Except, she looked around conspiratorially, as if someone might overhear her. Indeed, she would have died if, say, Nita should ever hear this. Somewhere I can do something, she whispered. Something big. Something that matters. Noted, said the computer. Next argument. The embarrassment of the admission out loud had driven everything out of her head. End arguments, she said. Advisory, said the computer. So advise me. Stated number of arguments defines a very large sample of destinations. Stated number of arguments allows for interference in transit by other instrumentalities. Odds of interference approximately 96%. That brought Dairine's chin up. Let them try, she said. The arguments stand. Girl, what the fuck does that mean? I can't believe that she's so blithe about it. Stated number of arguments allows for interference in transit by other instrumentalities. What does that even mean? That just means that people can fuck with where you're going? And you're just going to go what are you talking about? Just pick one that won't that won't interfere. There's got to be one of the options, because it said a very large sample of destinations, find one that it seems less likely that could happen. But she's just like, nah, whatever. I'm not worried about it. What are you talking about, you psychopath? So finally, name listed program trip 1. Named. Save it. Exit help facility. Run trip 1. Running. Input required. Specify. Birth date. Place of birth. Time of birth. Favorite color. Guys, again, I want to remind you all, this was published in 1990. I lived through the 90s, and I don't totally remember how advanced anything was in 1990 in terms of using computer. I think that you could use, if you had a computer at home, there was not yet internet for most people. You could do word processing, you could play some games. Then that was about it. I think there was some rudimentary email. The fact that this author has her basically do everything short of a CAPTCHA before it's able to function and execute the command that she has given it cracks me up to no end. There are a couple of websites that I have to use in order to pay bills or access information like my IRS account, things like this. And guys, it is such a headache to sign into some of these things because they have 12-factor authentication, and it is excruciating. One of the things that I get the most annoyed about, and this is the one that this is how it works with the IRS one, is that even if you enter your username and your password and everything correctly, they still want to text you a password, a 6-digit, passcode. And you have to do that every single time you log in. It's not just I can understand doing that just to make sure that the computer they are working from and the IP that they're working from is still valid and still safe. I can understand doing it once every couple of months, but every single time you log in, even when you just logged in half an hour ago, it's the worst. And the fact that this goes on, and that she is at later points sprinting through the fucking airport, and she has this thing asking her these banal questions. It almost asks her for her mother's maiden name and shit like that. Not quite, but practically. Guys, I just loved it so much. I thought this was so funny, and it's I would love to talk to the author and find out if they had any idea how accurate they were being with this when they wrote it. So here comes this thing that's very interesting, and I like the way this is described. She looked at a particularly busy knot of aliens across the floor. Security guards, most likely. They were armed in a big group and looking closely at people. Or were these critters security guards? There had been other creatures walking around in the terminal wearing uniforms, as much or as little clothing of a particular shade of silvery green as each alien in question felt like wearing, and their weapons had been slim little blue metal rods strapped to them. These creatures, though, they wore no uniforms, and their weapons were large and dark and looked nasty. Last book read, said the computer. Look, Dairine said, what do you need to know this dumb stuff for? Program cannot be accurately run without the enacting wizard's personal data. You have no data file saved at this time. Go on. Last book read. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire, said Dairine, looking with increasing unease at the armed bunch of aliens. They were not nice-looking people. Well, lots of the people in here didn't look nice. That purple jello thing, for one. But none of them felt bad. Just weird. But these creatures with the guns, they had an unfriendly look to them. Most of them were mud-colored, warty-looking creatures like a cross between lizards and toads, but upright and not nearly as pretty as a lizard or as helplessly homely as any toad. They went about with a lumpish, hunched-back swagger, and their eyes were dark-slitted bulges or fat, crimson, bloodshot goggle eyes. They looked stupid, and worse, they looked cruel. So I like this because of the really particular distinction the author is making between looking strange and alarming because of your strangeness and seeming actually threatening. And the fact that she says a lot of them didn't look nice, but none of them felt bad. Because that is a very difficult thing to quantify, and it's so frustrating because we all know what that means, but it's really not a convincing thing to hear from somebody else. Like, unless you know that person well enough to trust their judgment completely. If they just say, he seemed really nice, but I don't know, I got a really bad feeling from him, that can come across as seeming super, like, flaky, even vaguely new agey, depending on, like, the way that you say it or who you are. And it's tempting to discount that sort of assessment as being based in emotion and not facts. But the thing is that we have ways as human beings of detecting when somebody is dangerous that go beyond actual physical evidence. And I wish that we respected that a little bit more. It's frustrating, especially as a woman, because that's something that men don't have as finely tuned senses for. Men don't face the kinds of threats that women do all the time, and they have not had to develop their sensitivity to those dangers the way that women have. So a lot of times when we try and explain why we were nervous in a situation or why something got our attention or felt threatening, it's really hard to get that across in a way that a man will understand because they don't even have the vocabulary for it or the experience for it. And this like description of just these things feeling wrong to her. She's like, they haven't even done anything yet, but she can still tell that they're a threat. They are not something that she wants getting at her. She gets up and fucking runs. And they have this creature that like basically is the same as a sort of an attack dog that they release towards her. And she smashes it in the face with her computer. And it seems like she broke its jaw. And she's really thankful because the computer seems to be okay. Because if she had like fucked that thing up, who knows what would have happened. So she takes off and fucking starts sprinting. There's a sound of shooting and it's described as blaster bolts. So I'm assuming it's meant to be like a similar sound effect as the ones in Star Wars. She saw, let's see, one bolt went wide over her head. It hit a low floating bit of the ceiling off to one side, and she smelled the stink of scorched plastic and saw a glob of it fall molten to splat on the floor. What are they? Emissaries, said the computer. From where? Indeterminate. Continue run? If it'll get me out of here, yes. Level of education finished? Oh my God. I love that it's asking her these fucking questions while she's in the middle of running for her life. Like, this is just so funny to me. So one of them actually gets a hold of her. And this description again, let's see, where is it? Here it is. Yeah. Its eyes were an awful milky red that should have meant it was blind, but they saw her too well entirely. And it sang something high at her and grabbed her up against it with its other hand. The nonchalant, don't hurt it grasp of the upper arms that adults use on children, not knowing how they hate it or caring. That is really interesting, and I'm not sure that I can even say that I get what, like, it's described in such a specific way that I trust that this is something to some people. But for me, that one didn't, like, I didn't really know what was meant there. Dairine abruptly recognized the BEM's song as laughter once removed from the horrible low laughing she had seemed to hear in transit. And suddenly she knew what these things were, if not who. No, she screamed. So she just screams as she's trying to struggle to get away from this thing. She just screams, "Kill it." And the computer, which is listening for her command, something threw her back a clear good 20 feet and knocked her head against the floor. The BEM was gone. Or rather, it wasn't a BEM anymore. It was many little pieces of BEM scattered among splatters of dark liquid all over the floor and all over everything else in the area, including her. Everything smelled like an explosion in a coffee shop. I have to say that I really resent that these things smell like coffee, which is a wonderful smell. So pretty much she has like made it so that she isn't going to be taken alive at this point because of what she did. Whenever they come after her now, it's basically like shooting a cop. They're going to take her fucking down for it. And so she's continuing to flee, and she finally winds up in this bar. And there is somebody who gets up, and it's not like, I wondered for a second if this was one of the dudes that is going to be helping Nita and Kit, but it's not. It's just some random guy, which is part of what becomes sort of touching at the end of this chapter. And this dude offers to help her and tells her like exactly where to go behind the bar to get out of this particular bar, and then where to go to hide. They wouldn't really think of looking for her right away. And he sends her out, and she manages to get out and get the program for the computer running just in time, because they wind up coming in and sort of like hit her with some bolts that are meant to fry her up. And she can, I'm going to read this. A second later, heat not wholly felt stitched through her arms and legs as shots meant to cripple her tore through where they almost were and fried the back of the stall like an egg. Then starlight and the ancient black silence pierced through her brain. The spell tore Dairine free of the planet and flung her off rear hath B into the long night. She never found out anything about the man who had helped her, nor did he ever find out anything more about her. Pausing by the door of the pay toilet after being released from station security some hours later, and being telepathically sensitive as so many hominids are, he could sense only that some considerable power had been successfully exercised there. Satisfied with that, he smiled to himself and went on about his travels, just one more of the billions of hominids moving about the worlds. But many millions of light years later, in some baking wilderness, under a barren, brilliant sky, a bitterly weary Dairine paused in her flight, sat down on a stone, and cried for a while, in shock at the utter strangeness of the universe, where unexpected evil lies side by side with unexpected kindness, and neither ever seems quite to overcome the other. Guys, that fucked me up. That one, that sure did. Ugh. So chapter, well, again, these aren't numbered, but the chapter named Variables starts off with Nita, and she's gathering all of her stuff because she is going to be going after her sister. And this is a moment that I think is really remarkable in that it feels so totally different from other stories of this type. She is, like, I registered my shock that she had just gone ahead and told her parents about what was going on with her in the last book. I still approve wholeheartedly. I think that was the right move. But it is really surprising that she decided to go ahead and do that. And the thing that feels so different here is that even in books where kids have powers and their parents are aware of that, most of them, that is not a thing. They keep it to themselves. But even if they do know, it's usually a theoretical sort of thing where it's like, you know that I have these abilities, but you only see them in terms of like the fun aspects or the like magical as performance sort of thing, and you don't really think about what it is that I'm doing with these abilities. And their parents are often not subject to the same sort of like dangers or fears as the kids are who have these abilities. In this, her parents are not only aware that she has these powers, but they have been educated to know how dangerous it is out there, And that she herself, Nita, has almost died a couple times now. And like, not almost died like, oh, that could have happened. It was so close that the fact that she managed to get out of it is more of a miracle than anything. And her parents have to watch her pack up and head after her sister, who is 9 years old and, like, turns out has the same abilities as Nita. And they have to just, like, accept that and be okay with it. And that is the worst thing in the world. Like, can you imagine as a parent finding out that your kids had these sorts of abilities and that if they don't use them, the entire world will literally end. But if they do use them, they will likely die. And you just kind of have to decide whether or not you're willing to be that selfish. Because that's what it comes down to. They try and like lay down the law, and both Nita and Kit have to be like, look, you can tell us not to do this if you want, but you have to know that in the end, we're going to do what we think we need to do because we may be your kids, but also we have more power than you, and you can't really keep us here. Like, we're going to do what we need to do. And that just changes the power dynamic so completely. And her mother is just like really struggling with watching this all. I mean, of course, understandably. She says, Mom, she's real smart. Sometimes that makes me want to stuff her in the toilet, but it's going to come in handy for her now. She's not stupid, and if the wizard software in the computer is anything like our manuals, she'll have some help as long as she keeps her head and figures out what to ask for. If we get a move on, we'll catch up with her pretty quick. If you can find her. Nita's father loomed in the doorway, a big silver-haired shadow. Nita swallowed. Daddy shall leave a trail. Using wizardry changes the shape of the space-time continuum. It's like cutting through a room full of smoke with a knife. You can see where the knife's been. Knowing Dairine, she won't be making any effort to cover her trail, at least not just yet. We can follow her. If she's in trouble, we'll get her out of it. But I can't stay to talk about it. Kit needs me quick, and I can't do a lot for Dairine without him. Some, but not as much. We work best as a team. Her mother gave her father a look that Nita could make nothing of. When do you think you three will be back? Said her father. I don't know, Nita said. Mom, Dad, look, we might not be able to bring her back right away. It's her ordeal. Until she solves the problem she's supposed to be the answer to, if we pull her back, awful things could happen. If we'd copped out of ours, this whole world would be different. And believe me, you wouldn't have liked the difference. I've got to go. I'll clean up in there as soon as I get home, I promise. Nita said 3 words and was gone. So Nita is heading out after her sister, and meanwhile Dairine is flying through all of these different systems trying to get away from these things, which managed to track her until she finally yells at the computer, and the computer finally tells her, well, we're leaving a trail. What do you want from me? And she's like, holy shit, can we not leave a trail? And it says, yes, stealth procedures will decrease running speed. Stealth procedures are not 100% effective due to inherent core level stability string functions. She says, I'll settle. And if we don't have to keep wasting time running subroutines, you'll have more time to run the main program, won't you? So she manages to gain some ground after doing this for a few different jumps. And she's getting sick on the way as well because there are some pretty dramatic jumps. And she's heading finally so willy-nilly outward that she winds up in a totally different solar system, or a totally different galaxy is the one. The edge of the local group of galaxies might be far enough. She passed right through the coronation parade of one of the Anarchs of Delian 4 and never noticed it. She stood for only a second on a chilly planetoid being fought over by 2 desperate interstellar empires, and also missed the Nova bomb that turned the planetoid into plasma several minutes later. She stood on the metallic upper floors of a planet that was one great library full of 3 galaxies' knowledge, and she never knew what it was and probably at that point would not have cared. Only once did she pause for more than a few seconds, on a red sandstone promontory with a pinkish sea crashing at its foot, and no signs of life anywhere under the bloated red sun that dyed the water. Are they still following? Probability high, but at a greatly increased distance. You have enough time to finish the main program? Affirmative. do it then. So she's sitting there and she's really thinking about how, like, this was what she wanted, being able to visit places like this and see things like this pink sea and this, like, sunset. But now she's just realizing how completely, like, foolish she was for not figuring things out more before she left. I never want to smell coffee again, she thought. They had unquestionably been sent after her by what had laughed at her in the dark. At least she didn't hear it laughing anymore while she was in transit. Then again, that might not be good. Let it be, then. I'm not going to be running for long. I'm going to turn around and give it something to think about. If I can just figure out what to do and find a weapon. So she finally makes her last jump to the area that has the silicone, like, snow sort of thing. And this is when she's outside of the Milky Way, and it's a whole other wild-looking galaxy. And let's see. I have a couple days to rest and do some research, huh? So she is, like, investigating the lone power and its weaknesses and its abilities, and she looks into some of the, like, more recent battles with it, and she finds the one that tells about Nita and what went down with Nita, and she's just shocked. She's like, holy shit, I knew she had abilities, but I didn't know she was out here doing stuff like this. And she makes herself a sandwich and keeps on reading and is investigating her surroundings on how things, like, work. And as she gets to the computer and she's looking through things, she hit the return for another screenful of data, and the screenful appeared and her stomach flipped again. And it starts off with planetary history, but then it begins to dissolve into just ones. And she thinks that she fried the computer, and she doesn't really know how to fix this. And that's the end of the chapter, which I don't care for at all, as I'm sure you guys understand. Like, no, being stranded on another fucking planet in a whole other galaxy, and your one method of, like, traveling and communicating and learning about where you are has broken down. No, don't care for it. So we'll see what happens there. But guys, I'm a little afraid for her. I do like her still, despite myself. But Dairine, girl, you gotta figure some shit out about your life, lady. All right, guys. Well, thank you all again so much for listening. Thank you to Devin for commissioning this episode. And I will hopefully be seeing you all again soon with a new episode. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.